Hello, viewers, and welcome to the M.O.W. channel. Do you know the movie Scream? The man who inspired that film and the figure who carved one of the darkest, most brutal chapters in American crime history is Danny Harold Rolling. Today, we will take an in-depth look at his life, focusing on the early years when his monstrous nature was formed, and on his twisted path leading up to the moment just before he descended upon Gainesville. Crime experts often say that serial killers do not simply fall from the sky. Their madness is cultivated slowly, over many years, through abuse, isolation, and warped fantasies. Danny Rolling's story began exactly that way. Born on May 26, 1954, in Shreveport, Louisiana, Rolling was not a child welcomed with love. His father, James Rolling, was a former Navy man and a police officer, but inside the home, he was a merciless tyrant. James routinely told young Danny that he should never have been born. He subjected him to brutal physical abuse over the smallest habits. Beatings for something as trivial as breathing too loudly, or threats to slap handcuffs on him and drag him to the police station, were everyday occurrences in this broken household. Living under this constant reign of terror planted deep rage inside Danny, along with an intense need to escape reality through fantasy. Rather than confronting his father directly, he began venting his suppressed desire for control by abusing defenseless animals and secretly spying on women, engaging in voyeuristic behavior. One incident, in particular, shattered what little emotional core he had left. Danny witnessed his beloved pet dog die in his arms after being violently abused by his father. From that moment on, his emotions seemed to dry up completely. He grew numb to the suffering of others and began to see himself as a victim, abandoned by the world, nurturing a growing desire for revenge against society itself. By his teenage years, Rolling's criminal behavior had escalated far beyond youthful rebellion. Wandering through Georgia and Alabama, he committed armed robberies and home invasions, acts that would later serve as rehearsals for the horrors to come. As an adult, he briefly appeared to seek a normal life, working as a waiter at Poncho's restaurant, but the darkness inside him had already reached a point beyond control. In May 1990, Danny Rolling finally unleashed his rage in its most direct form. He fired a gun at the face of his father, the man who had tormented him for decades. James Rolling narrowly survived, but this act destroyed the last remaining moral restraint within Danny. From that moment on, he was no longer a criminal hiding in the shadows. He had awakened as a predator determined to carve his existence into the world. Leaving Louisiana behind, he headed for sunny Florida, consumed by a delusion that he would build his own kingdom in a place filled with beautiful young women. By the time he arrived in Gainesville, he was no longer just a fugitive. Inside his backpack were a razor-sharp K-bar knife, duct tape, and a cassette recorder to document his crimes. He was like a starving wolf, searching for prey. Choosing Gainesville was no accident. The city was packed with college students, filled with low-rise apartment buildings that were easy to break into. The chaos of the early academic term provided the perfect hunting ground for a killer. Rolling set up a hidden campsite in the woods and carefully surveyed the area. He watched students when they left for class, when they returned, when they slept, and which routes they took. Piece by piece, he constructed his own horrific scenario. Later, Rolling would confess that he wanted to become a legendary killer like Ted Bundy, a superstar who commanded national attention. This twisted hunger for fame, combined with a lifetime of abuse and sadistic impulses, meant that Gainesville was about to face an unprecedented bloodbath. The once peaceful college town was slowly being swallowed by an invisible shadow of terror. Just before Danny Rolling opened his first door, the air in Gainesville grew heavier and colder than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, from this point on, we will step directly into the crime scenes of the brutal massacre that unfolded in Gainesville over 4 horrific days in August 1990. When Danny Rolling emerged from his campsite in the woods, the first place he set his sights on was the Williston Court Apartments. The early morning air of August 24th was humid and heavy, and the entire city lay in a deep sleep. 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell had only recently moved into the apartment, fresh out of high school and filled with excitement about beginning their college lives. Rolling slipped into their home like a ghost, entering through the sliding glass door. At the back of the apartment, he first noticed Powell asleep on the downstairs couch, but he did not attack her right away. Instead, he quietly climbed the stairs, carefully suppressing the sound of his footsteps, and headed toward Sonia Larson's bedroom upstairs. Startled awake by the presence of an intruder, Larson instinctively tried to fight back, but she was quickly overpowered by his strength. Rolling sealed her screams with tape and then ended her life with a sharp knife. What makes this even more chilling is what happened next. After killing Larson, Rolling went back downstairs and woke Christina Powell. He restrained her, sexually assaulted her, and asserted his dominance through terror and violence. After taking 2 innocent lives, Rowling carried out a grotesque ritual. He posed the victims' bodies in sexualized positions and placed a mirror nearby to maximize the psychological shock for whoever would discover the scene. This was not merely murder, it was an extreme expression of sadism, designed to shatter the minds of others. Before the adrenaline of his first attack had even faded, Rowling began his second hunt on August 25. This time, his target was 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, a hard-working and dedicated student. Rowling broke into her apartment and had the nerve to wait inside for her to return. After a late night playing racquetball, Hoyt came home only to come face to face with death waiting for her. He overpowered her, dragged her into the bedroom, and committed a horrific sexual assault. He then stabbed her in the back, inflicting fatal wounds, and brutally mutilated her body in ways that are difficult to put into words. Most disturbingly, Rowling decapitated Hoyt and placed her head on a shelf. The scene was so shocking that even the seasoned police officers, who later discovered it would suffer lifelong trauma from what they saw. Rowling carried out these acts with a chilling calm, as if completing a work of art. Before leaving, he even took the time to shower. News of these atrocities spread rapidly throughout Gainesville. The University of Florida campus fell into a funeral-like silence, replacing what should have been a lively academic atmosphere. Students no longer walked alone. Furniture was stacked against doors, and baseball bats and kitchen knives were kept within reach as people tried to sleep. But as if mocking the city's fear, Rowling struck again on August 27. His third attack claimed the lives of 23-year-old Tracy Pauls and her roommate, Manny Taboada. Although Taboada was a physically strong man, Rowling subdued him through a sudden ambush. Taboada fought desperately to protect his friend, but he could not escape Rowling's merciless blade. After killing Taboada, Rowling found Pauls hiding in the adjacent room. She had locked the door and tried to resist, but Rowling broke in and assaulted her. Even at this final crime scene, his pathological obsession continued. He repositioned Paul's body into a specific pose, adjusted the lighting in the room to make the corpse more visible, and once again treated the scene as a grotesque display. Over the course of 4 days, 5 students lost their lives in this unprecedented series of murders, shaking the entire nation. Police declared a state of emergency and mobilized every available resource, but the identity of the killer remained unknown. Gainesville's nights were no longer safe. The city had transformed into a landscape of death, where no one could feel secure. Ladies and gentlemen, after the storm of serial murders that plunged Gainesville into sheer terror had finally passed, law enforcement began the hunt for the killer under unprecedented pressure. In the early stages of the investigation, police focused on the bizarre and ritualistic nature of the crime scenes. The deliberate positioning of the bodies and the careful arrangement of the scenes suggested a highly methodical offender with a powerful need for attention and control. However, there was a critical problem. There was very little direct evidence that clearly identified the killer. At the time, police named a local college student with a history of mental illness, Edward Humphrey, as their primary suspect, and launched an intensive investigation. The media repeatedly broadcast his image, portraying him as a monster. This would later be recorded as one of the most serious investigative mistakes in the history of the case. While all eyes were fixed on Humphrey, the real killer Danny Rowling was revealing himself somewhere else entirely. The decisive breakthrough came from a city about 40 miles south of Gainesville, Ocala. On September 7, 1990, 10 days after the Gainesville murders, a man was arrested at the scene of an armed robbery at a supermarket. That man was Danny Rowling. At the time, Ocala police believed they had caught nothing more than a routine robbery suspect and incarcerated him at the Marion County Jail. But investigators from the Gainesville Task Force noticed striking similarities between the tools used in the robbery and those used in the Gainesville murders. In particular, a screwdriver and knife found in Rowling's bag matched the marks and entry methods found at the Gainesville apartment crime scenes. As the investigation progressed, detectives confirmed that Rowling's blood type B matched the blood type found at the murder scenes, tightening the net around him. Around this time, a shocking tip arrived from the Shreveport Police Department in Louisiana. They reported that a triple homicide that occurred in November 1989 bore an uncanny resemblance to the Gainesville murders. In that case, 55-year-old William Grissom, his daughter Julie, and his 8-year-old grandson Sean were found brutally murdered inside their home. Notably, Julie Grissom's body had also been washed and posed in a specific position. Florida law enforcement investigator Don Maines immediately flew to Louisiana to examine the possible connection between the two cases. After comparing physical evidence and crime scene methods, The investigative team became convinced that all of these atrocities were the work of the same individual. What ultimately sealed the case was the courage of an ordinary citizen. A Shreveport resident named Cindy Jurkic saw news coverage of the Gainesville murders and was reminded of someone she had known in the past, Danny Rolling. She told police that Rolling had often displayed a disturbing obsession with knives, and had once bragged that he would go somewhere filled with beautiful women and commit terrible acts. Her tip became the critical key that unified the scattered pieces of the investigation. Police thoroughly searched Rolling's campsite in the woods and recovered audio cassette tapes in which he recorded his emotions before and after the murders, along with personal belongings taken from the victims. On the tapes, Rolling spoke calmly about an alternate personality he called Gemini, describing the pleasure and fear he experienced while killing. These recordings became crucial evidence, proving that he was not an impulsive murderer, but someone who deliberately documented and commemorated his crimes. Investigators also confirmed that Rolling was responsible for an earlier crime in Sarasota in early August 1990, in which a woman was bound and sexually assaulted. Through relentless police work, forensic science, and brave civilian cooperation, the true identity of the Gainesville Ripper was finally revealed to the world. Danny Harold Rolling. Now, there was nowhere left to run. He would face justice in a court of law. Ladies and gentlemen, the story now moves away from the blood-soaked crime scenes and into the solemn, hard-fought records of the courtroom. In November 1991, Danny Harold Rolling was formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of rape and armed robbery. However, it would take nearly 4 years before the trial actually began. During that time, investigators fully established his connection to the triple homicide in Louisiana, and an extensive series of psychiatric evaluations was conducted to assess Rolling's mental state. Finally, in 1994, with the eyes of the world fixed on a Florida courtroom, the trial began. What shocked the public most was Rolling's sudden and dramatic action. On the very first day of court, without consulting his defense attorneys, he abruptly pleaded guilty to all charges, sending waves of disbelief through the courtroom. This unexpected confession was not an act of remorse or repentance. Criminal psychologists interpreted it as a display of Rolling's overwhelming need for attention, a desire to showcase his crimes, and cast himself as the central figure on the grand stage of the courtroom. Rolling claimed that an evil alternate personality he called Gemini had ordered him to kill, attempting to shift responsibility away from himself. But the conclusions of the prosecution's psychiatric experts were unequivocal. Rolling did not suffer from dissociative identity disorder. Instead, he was diagnosed as a textbook psychopath marked by antisocial personality disorder and extreme narcissistic traits, deriving pleasure from the suffering of others. He fully understood the moral and legal consequences of his actions. He simply chose to use innocent lives as tools for his own gratification. Throughout the trial, Rolling's warped sense of self-importance was laid bare. He openly stated that he wanted to become a superstar killer, standing alongside figures like Ted Bundy, who had terrorized America in the 1970s. These statements inflicted unbearable pain on the victims' families and convinced the jury that Rolling was a man who could never safely exist within society. Even behind bars, his disturbing behavior continued. Rolling drew pictures of his murder scenes, wrote poems about his crimes, and attempted to profit from his notoriety. These actions only fueled public outrage and reinforced the image of a man utterly devoid of humanity. The case also left a lasting mark on popular culture. At the time, screenwriter Kevin Williamson was deeply affected by news coverage of the Gainesville murders. He focused on how ordinary daily life could instantly turn into terror, and on the suffocating pressure created by an unseen killer. Those ideas would later give birth to Scream, a film that redefined the modern slasher genre. The movie's depiction of a killer who taunts victims and leaves bodies posed for discovery was directly inspired by Danny Rolling's real-life crimes. In the end, Rolling achieved what he had always wanted, to become a lasting motif in popular culture. But it was not a legacy of fame or admiration. It was a permanent record of the most vile and despicable side of humanity. During sentencing, the defense argued for leniency based on Rolling's abusive childhood. The court acknowledged that the extreme violence inflicted by his father had played a role in shaping him. However, the judge ruled that a tragic past could never justify the brutal destruction of innocent lives. On April 20, 1994, following a unanimous recommendation from the jury, the judge sentenced Danny Harold Rolling to death. Even as the sentence was read, Rolling showed no visible emotion, calmly humming a strange tune, an unsettling final display of his complete loss of humanity. The Gainesville Ripper was no longer a predator stalking the night. He was now a condemned man, waiting on death row for his turn to face the ultimate judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, now we follow the final journey of Danny Harold Rolling, the man known as the Gainesville Ripper, who plunged the entire United States into fear. After being sentenced to death in 1994, Rowling spent 12 years on death row under the highest level of security in the state of Florida. During that time, he repeatedly exercised his legal rights, filing appeal after appeal in an effort to delay his execution. Even in prison, he remained a deeply disturbing figure. He wrote poems that glorified his crimes and created detailed yet deeply unsettling drawings, attempting to have them released to the outside world. For the victims' families, these acts amounted to a second wave of cruelty, shameless attempts to exploit the justice system to preserve his notoriety. But time ultimately moved in favor of justice. In 2006, a U.S. federal court rejected Rowling's final appeal. Once his execution date was set, his behavior began to change, at least on the surface. He sent a letter to his spiritual advisor, Reverend Mike Hudspeth, confessing to his past sins. In that letter was a detailed admission of responsibility for the Grissom family murders in Shreveport, Louisiana, long suspected but never fully confirmed. Only at the edge of death did Rowling formally acknowledge responsibility for the 8 lives he had taken. Whether this was genuine repentance or simply one last attempt to complete the record of his crimes remains a matter of debate. On October 25, 2006, the day of his execution, Rowling requested a final meal of lobster tail with butter, a baked potato, and strawberry cheesecake. He ate calmly and showed little sign of agitation. As he was led to the execution chamber, behind the glass stood the parents who had lost their children, and surviving family members who watched him in silence. Rowling was given the opportunity to make a final statement, but he said nothing. Instead, he quietly hummed a gospel hymn as the lethal drugs began to flow. At 6:13 p.m., as the poison moved through his veins, Danny Rowling was pronounced dead. With his death, legal justice reached its conclusion, but the social impact of his crimes continues to confront us with difficult questions even today. This case led to significant changes in the American criminal justice system. It highlighted the critical importance of DNA analysis in violent crimes involving sexual assault and accelerated efforts to refine investigative methods to reduce errors during suspect identification. The case of Edward Humphrey, who was wrongly targeted early in the investigation, became a painful lesson in how reckless media coverage and trial by public opinion can destroy an innocent person's life. Humphrey later cleared his name and went on to graduate from college with high honors. But the psychological scars he endured can never truly be undone. Through the monster known as Danny Rowling, we witness just how far human evil can reach, but we must also remember the resilience of the Gainesville community, the people who endured terror and fought to reclaim their everyday lives. Today, memorials honoring the victims stand on campus grounds. Once overshadowed by fear, peace has returned, but the memory of the tragedy lives on, through those who still carry it with them. Before we consume criminals as movie inspirations or objects of morbid curiosity, we must first remember the ordinary neighbors whose dreams and lives were crushed. That is the true lesson this tragedy demands of us. Danny Rowling did succeed in claiming a page in history, but not as a legend or an icon. He remains a warning, one of the most vile examples of humanity that must never be forgotten, but never glorified. That concludes today's story. Please don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. We'll be back tomorrow with a new case and a new mystery. Thank you sincerely for watching.